In the shadowed corners of medieval history, where fact and legend blur together like fading ink on ancient parchment, lies a story both haunting and strange. It speaks of innocence and faith, of a march led not by kings or generals, but by children. They carried no weapons, only crosses carved from wood, and a belief so fierce it rivaled the faith of empires. Some call it the Children's Crusade, others call it a myth. Tonight, we walk the uncertain road between history and legend, and follow the footsteps of the children who vanished into time. The year was 1212. Europe was restless, weary from decades of holy wars. For nearly a century, wave after wave of crusaders had set out for the Holy Land, answering the call of popes and kings to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. They were knights in chainmail, soldiers with banners snapping in the wind, their swords blessed by priests. Yet despite their zeal, despite oceans of blood spilled across 2 continents, Jerusalem remained a distant dream. It was in this world, torn by faith and war, that whispers began to spread. Whispers of children. No one knew quite when the first stories began. Perhaps it was in a quiet village in northern France, where peasants spoke of a boy who claimed to hear the voice of Christ. His name was Stephen, no older than 12 or 13. He was said to have stood in the marketplace of Cloyes, his face pale and shining with conviction, and declared that God had chosen him to lead a new crusade. But this would be no ordinary army, not knights, not hardened soldiers. This would be an army of the pure. Children, he said, untainted by the greed and sins of the grown world, would succeed where kings and warriors had failed. The seas themselves, Stephen claimed, would part before them. Jerusalem would fall not to the sword, but to the innocence of faith. At first, perhaps, the villagers laughed, but word spread quickly, as it always did in an age hungry for signs and wonders. Before long, dozens of children gathered around Stephen, then hundreds. They carried crude wooden crosses. Some wore scraps of white cloth sewn with tiny red crosses, imitating the surcoats of knights they had never seen. Their parents wept, begged them to stay. But the children believed it was not only in France. Far to the east, in the Rhineland of Germany, another boy was said to have risen, Nicholas of Cologne. Like Stephen, Nicholas claimed visions, divine commands, and like Stephen, he gathered a following. Children from villages along the Rhine left their homes to march south toward Italy, believing the Mediterranean itself would obey them. 2 boys, 2 marches, France and Germany. Some chronicles suggest their stories were connected, threads of the same tapestry. Others insist they were separate, coincidences born of the same restless century. We cannot be sure. Medieval records are sparse, contradictory, blurred by time and legend. But we know this, by summer's end, thousands of children were on the roads of Europe. Peasants watched them pass in barefoot, faces alight with strange determination. Some were no older than 8 or 9. Others were teenagers, strong enough to help carry food or guide the younger ones along the rutted paths. A few adults traveled with them, priests, wandering monks, women desperate to protect their sons and daughters. But it was the children who filled the chronicles, the children who made the story burn so brightly in memory. Where did they find such faith? The answer lies, perhaps, in the age itself. The Middle Ages were a time of visions, relics, miracles proclaimed from pulpits and marketplaces. Ordinary people longed for signs of God's presence in a world plagued by war, famine, and disease. When a shepherd boy claimed to hear Christ, when he promised that children could free Jerusalem with prayer alone. It was easy to believe, so they marched. Stephen's followers in France headed south toward the port of Marseille and Nicholas's. Followers in Germany wound their way through the Alps toward Italy, two rivers of children flowing toward the same vast sea. The journey was brutal. The summer of 1212 was blistering, the roads choked with dust. Food was scarce. Villagers along the way were poor, unable to feed hundreds of sudden travelers. Some children collapsed from exhaustion. Others turned back, slipping away at night to find the long road home. And yet, many pressed on. Chroniclers, tell us, they sang as they marched. Hymns, prayers, chants carried on the wind like ghostly choirs. It must have been a strange sight. Miles of children trudging through fields and forests, their voices rising in thin, unwavering faith. But there were darker moments too. Bands of robbers haunted the roads. Some children were stolen, sold into servitude, lost forever. There are stories, perhaps true, perhaps only warnings invented later of villagers slamming their gates against the marching children, afraid of famine or disease. Still, the main groups reached their destinations. Stephen's followers came at last to Marseille, staring out at the endless blue of the Mediterranean. Nicholas's followers descended from the Alps into the Italian plains, heading for the port of Genoa. They believed the sea would part. They believed the waters would open a path to Jerusalem, as the Red Sea had for Moses in the book of Exodus. After all, had Stephen not promised it? Had Nicholas not spoken of divine visions? But the sea lay silent, stretching to the horizon, unbroken and impassive. Here, in the Chronicles, the story begins to fracture. Some say the children waited for days, praying on the beaches, their faith slowly eroding under the weight of reality. Others claim shipowners appeared, offering passage to the Holy Land offers that would end in betrayal and tragedy. What is certain is this: the children's crusade, whether born of faith or folly, did not reach Jerusalem. But the story does not end here, because what happened next is where legend and history intertwine so tightly we may never separate them. The sea did not move. Day after day, the children watched the waves break on the rocky shores of Marseille and Genoa. They prayed, sang hymns until their voices cracked, waited for a miracle that never came. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, and food ran out. Some chronicles describe them wandering the docks, hungry and confused, asking sailors if they had seen the signs of God upon the waters. The sailors only shrugged. To them, the children were little more than ragged pilgrims, another band of zealots chasing divine promises. But then, according to some accounts, a new promise appeared, this time from men of flesh and blood in Marseille. Two wealthy merchants offered the children ships. Their names were said to be Hugo Farias and William of Pasquias, though time has blurred their identities. They promised to carry the children safely to the Holy Land, free of charge. Perhaps they saw themselves as saviors. Perhaps they saw opportunity in the naive faith of thousands of starving travelers. The chronicles cannot agree. What they do agree on is this: 7 ships were prepared. The children boarded, their hearts lifted once more by hope. Some waved from the decks as the ships pulled away from the harbor, believing they were at last on their way to Jerusalem. That the sea had yielded, after all, not by miracle, but by the charity of men. It is here that the story turns dark. 2 of the ships never reached any port. A storm, fierce and sudden, smashed them against the coast of Sardinia. Every soul aboard was lost to the waves. The remaining 5 ships sailed on, but not to the Holy Land. Years later, a tale would emerge, whispered by monks and merchants, that the ships had sailed instead to the markets of North Africa. The children, it was said, were sold as slaves in Tunis or Alexandria. Some were forced into labor. Others vanished into the palaces and harems of wealthy buyers. A few, perhaps, were taken to the Middle East after Albert, not as pilgrims. Were these stories true, or were they born from the medieval taste for tragedy, for moral lessons about innocence betrayed? We cannot know for certain. Records from North Africa are silent, and European chronicles contradict each other wildly. Some insist the merchants themselves were later hanged for treachery, their ships seized by outraged kings. Others claim no such justice was ever served, that the men simply vanished, leaving behind only rumors and grief-stricken parents. As for the children who followed Nicholas into Italy, their fate was scarcely better. They had marched over the Alps, endured hunger and exhaustion, only to find the ports closed to them. In Genoa, the city fathers feared chaos if thousands of homeless children remained too long. Some chroniclers say the gates were opened briefly, the children allowed to rest before being driven out again. Others claim many settled there. Their crusade ended not by shipwreck or slavery, but by cold practicality. Nicholas himself disappears from the records soon after. One tale claims he tried to lead his followers onward to Rome, seeking the blessing of Pope Innocent III. The Pope, according to legend, praised the children's faith, but gently told them to go home. Jerusalem, he said, could not be won by children. Some obeyed. Others wandered for years, dying on the roads or settling far from the villages where they were born. The chronicles fall silent here, as if ashamed, because whatever the truth storm, slavery, hunger, or simple disillusionment, Ruap never saw most of those children again, yet the story refused to die within a generation. Poets and priests were already shaping it into legend. They spoke of innocent martyrs, of faith betrayed by wicked men, of a world too corrupt to deserve such purity. In their sermons, the children became symbols rather than people, their suffering proof of divine mysteries beyond human understanding. But beneath the hymns and moral lessons, a question remained. Had there really been tens of thousands of children? Medieval numbers are notoriously unreliable. Chroniclers loved to inflate figures for drama or piety. Some modern historians believe the so-called children may have included many adult peasants, the poor, wandering laborers swept up in a religious movement larger than themselves. In medieval Latin, the word pueri could mean both children and the humble or those of low status. Perhaps it was never truly a crusade of children alone, but rather of the dispossessed, the desperate, the faithful poor. If so, the legend changes shape. It becomes not only a story of innocence betrayed, but of class and suffering, of how the powerless grasped at visions when the powerful failed them, and yet, even if some were grown, there were surely children among them. Medieval villages were small. A boy of 12, marching away with a wooden cross, would burn himself into memory far more vividly than a nameless peasant with a sack of bread. Parents would remember the empty doorways, the quiet hearths where laughter had once rung. Grief keeps such memories alive, long after facts decay. So the story spread. Monks copied it into chronicles. Preachers thundered about it from pulpits. Artists painted pale-faced children trudging through forests with angels overhead. The details shifted with every tellings. 7 ships or 12, 2 prophets or 1. betrayal or miracle, but the heart of the tale endured, a march of innocence, vanishing into tragedy. By the time centuries had passed, it had become part of Europe's spiritual folklore, retold whenever faith and innocence needed martyrs. But historians, patient and skeptical, would one day return to the scattered clues and ask, what really happened in 1212? Was there truly a children's crusade, or only a legend born of rumor and grief? The answers, like the children themselves, are elusive, because as we follow the faint trail they left across medieval Europe, we find not certainty, but fragments. A letter here, a sermon there, a half-remembered name in a monastery record. Each piece suggests a story both larger and smaller than the legend, less miraculous, perhaps, but no less human. And the deeper we look, the more we realize how thin the line is between history and myth, between what happened and what we choose to remember. For even now, 8 centuries later, the children's crusade refuses to stay quiet. It lingers like footsteps fading down a long, dark road, a road we will follow a little farther into the tangled heart of history itself. When we turn from the story itself to the records that claim to preserve it, we step into a labyrinth. The Middle Ages left us chronicles, letters, and sermons, yet they are as uneven as the roads the children walked. Some were written decades after 1212 by monks who had never seen the events themselves. Others survive only in fragments, copied and recopied until the ink faded and the meaning blurred. What we know of the children's crusade comes to us through this mist, and in that mist details shift like shadows. One of the earliest accounts comes from a chronicle known as the Chronica Regia Coloniensis, written in Cologne not long after the events. It mentions Nicholas of Germany leading a band of children toward Italy, hoping to reach the Holy Land. The writer gives no number of followers, no speeches from Nicholas, no promises of seas parting. It is a simple note, almost casual, as if the story was one among many small movements of faith sweeping through Europe. Yet later, chroniclers seized upon that note and gave it flesh and drama, turning a brief mention into a saga of thousands. A different account, from France, tells of Stephen of Cloyes carrying a letter for King Philip II. In this version, Stephen claimed the letter was from Christ himself, delivered to him by a mysterious pilgrim. When he brought it to the king, Philip dismissed him, declaring the whole affair a fantasy. But word had already spread among the villagers, and children were gathering even as the king shook his head. Whether this meeting with Philip ever happened is impossible to prove, yet the image of a boy standing before a king with a divine letter proved irresistible to later storytellers. Then there are the sermons. Medieval preachers loved the story of the children's crusade. It became a moral lesson about misplaced zeal, or, depending on the preacher, about the purity of faith uncorrupted by age and ambition. One sermon described the children as martyrs whose innocence shamed the corruption of knights and kings. Another thundered that their fate was punishment for pride, that only humility could win divine favor. Each preacher bent the story toward his own lesson, and with every retelling the line between fact and allegory grew thinner. By the 14th century, the story had taken on almost mythic proportions. Chroniclers wrote of 30,000 children marching across Europe. They wrote of miracles along the way, of crosses shining in the sky, of angels guiding the young crusaders through forests and mountains. None of these details appear in the earliest sources. They are the embroidery of time, threads added by writers who wanted drama and wonder. Yet amid the exaggerations, there remain stubborn facts. Multiple chronicles, separated by distance and language, agree that large groups of young people traveled across France and Germany in 1212 with the intention of reaching the Holy Land. They agree that most never returned. They agree that storms wrecked ships near Sardinia, and that many children vanished afterward, whether into slavery or into the vast silence of the Mediterranean. These points form the skeleton of history upon which centuries of legend would hang. Their colorful garments. Modern historians have tried to strip those garments away. In the 19th and 20th centuries, scholars began re-examining the medieval texts with critical eyes. They noted the confusion over the Latin word pueri. Did it truly mean children, or could it mean the rural poor, the landless laborers, who filled Europe's roads in times of famine? If the latter, then perhaps the Children's Crusade was less a march of innocence than a mass migration of desperate peasants, drawn together by visions and charismatic leaders. This interpretation changes the story's heart. Instead of thousands of children leaving home out of pure faith, we might imagine villages emptied by poverty and hunger, their people clinging to the hope of a new life in the Holy Land. In such a world, a boy like Nicholas or Stephen could become a prophet simply by giving shape to that hope, promising that God would open the way. The story would still be tragic, but less miraculous, more human. Yet even this revision cannot erase the medieval parents who truly did lose children. In 1212, some chronicles mention mothers wailing as their sons and daughters marched away. Others tell of children returning months later, thin and broken, with tales of hunger and betrayal. These glimpses remind us that behind the sermons and chronicles were real families, real villages, real grief. Whether or not 30,000 children set out, some number surely did, and their fates became seeds from which legend grew as the centuries turned. Those legends spread far beyond the monasteries. Poets wrote ballads about the lost children of 1212. Painters in later ages imagined long lines of pale-faced boys and girls walking under stormy skies, their small hands clutching crosses, angels hovering above them. Playwrights wove the story into dramas about innocence and corruption, about faith and folly. The Children's Crusade became a canvas on which each generation painted its own fears and hopes. In the 19th century, when Europe was gripped by Romanticism's love of tragic beauty, the story flourished again. Writers saw in it the ultimate image of doomed idealism, of youth betrayed by a cruel world. Poems spoke of golden-haired children vanishing into the sea, their prayers unanswered, their purity swallowed by waves and slavers. Historians tried to separate truth from legend, but the public preferred the legend. It was too haunting, too poetic to abandon. Even today, the Children's Crusade lingers on the edges of popular imagination. Novels and films borrow its imagery. Songs and plays echo its themes. The sight of children marching with faith, brighter than swords, only to vanish into hunger and storms, continues to haunt us 8 centuries later. Yet the historian keeps asking what truly happened in 1212. To answer, we must weigh each chronicle, each sermon, each rumor of storms and slavers, and decide which pieces belong to history and which to legend. The task is maddening, for the sources contradict one another at every turn. Some claim Nicholas reached Rome, others insist he died in Italy. Some call Stephen a prophet, others call him a mad boy leading innocents to doom. The numbers of children swell and shrink with each account like waves rising and falling on the Mediterranean itself. Still, through the confusion, a shape emerges. Two movements, one in France, one in Germany, both in 1212, both led by young visionaries. Thousands followed, though perhaps not the tens of thousands later writers claimed. They traveled south toward the sea, believing God would carry them to Jerusalem. The sea did not part. Storms and hunger scattered them. Some may have been sold into slavery. Few returned home. That shape, stark and unstable, is what the records support, and yet legend will not release the story. It clings to it, dressing it again and again in miracles and betrayals, in innocence and martyrdom, because something in the tale speaks to a truth beyond facts. It speaks to the power of faith, to the vulnerability of youth, to the eternal human longing for deliverance. That is why the Children's Crusade, whether history or myth, has never faded from memory. As we leave the tangled chronicles behind, we return to the road itself, to the image of children and peasants and wanderers trudging through the dust of medieval Europe, following a dream they believed was holy. The chronicles may argue, but the road keeps its secrets. Somewhere along that road lies the heart of the story, beating faintly across 800 years, waiting for us to listen. When the marches of 1212 dissolved into hunger, storms, and rumors of betrayal, Europe did not immediately know what had happened. News traveled slowly in the Middle Ages, carried by merchants, wandering monks, and letters read aloud in marketplaces. For weeks and months after the children vanished toward the sea, families waited, hoping for word from their sons and daughters. Some children straggled home in ones and twos, thin as scarecrows, with stories of long roads, empty villages, and promises broken by the waves. Others never returned at all. Chroniclers tell us that grief spread through villages like winter frost. Mothers prayed at church altars for children who would never again walk through the door. Fathers listened in silence as travelers brought news from France or Italy, each rumor cutting away the last threads of hope. Some stories claimed the children had reached the Holy Land after all, and would soon return in triumph. Others told of storms that swallowed entire ships, of slavers who carried the young crusaders to markets across the Mediterranean. With each telling, the stories grew darker, and the truth became harder to find. Kings and princes heard the rumors too. In France, King Philip II, who had already dismissed Stephen when the boy claimed to carry a letter from Christ, ordered surviving children to return home if they could. He issued no punishment for Stephen himself, perhaps seeing the boy as a dreamer rather than a criminal. The French court soon turned its attention back to the endless wars with England, leaving the fate of the crusading children to monks and chroniclers. In Germany, Emperor Otto IV barely noticed the movement at all. His empire stretched across half of Europe and was riven with its own disputes. A band of children marching south through the Alps was hardly his concern. To the great lords of the Holy Roman Empire, the Children's Crusade seemed less a matter of state than a curiosity, a story whispered by travelers rather than proclaimed in royal councils. The Church, however, could not ignore it. Pope Innocent III, who had launched the Fourth Crusade a decade earlier, reportedly heard of the children with a mixture of wonder and sorrow. Some accounts claim he praised their faith while lamenting their tragedy, declaring that the zeal of the young shamed the cold hearts of older crusaders. Yet he offered no new crusade to replace theirs, no armies to finish what the children had begun. The papacy, already burdened by politics and rivalries, let the matter rest. Still, the story refused to fade. Monks across Europe began copying accounts of the Children's Crusade into their chronicles. Each monastery added details drawn from rumor or imagination. In one version, angels guided the children by night. In another, the devil himself raised the storm that smashed their ships against Sardinia. Some writers claimed the merchants who lured the children onto ships were agents of Muslim rulers, plotting to capture Christian youth for sale in distant markets. Others insisted the merchants were punished by God, their own ships sinking in later storms as divine judgment for their betrayal. These accounts spread through Christendom, turning a brief, confused event into a moral drama. Preachers used it to warn against false prophets, holding up Stephen and Nicholas as examples of pride leading to ruin. Others used the story to condemn greed, blaming merchants and kings for failing to protect the innocent. A few even saw the children as martyrs whose purity put adult crusaders to shame. The story became a mirror in which each writer saw the lesson he wished to teach. Over time, legends attached themselves like vines to a crumbling wall. One tale claimed Stephen himself performed miracles along the road, healing the sick and multiplying food for his followers like Christ feeding the 5,000. Another said Nicholas reached the Pope in Rome, who blessed the children before sending them home, though no official record of such a meeting exists. In some versions, the children marched barefoot through snow without feeling the cold, their faith keeping them warm as saints in the making. Medieval Europe loved such stories. The age was filled with tales of wonder, relics that bled, statues that wept, saints who tamed wolves or spoke with birds. Against that backdrop, the idea of thousands of children marching across Europe under divine command fit easily into the medieval imagination. Whether or not the details were true mattered less than the lessons the story carried about faith, sacrifice, and innocence in a sinful world. Yet not everyone accepted the legend so easily. A few chroniclers wrote with sharp disapproval, calling the crusade foolish and reckless. They blamed parents for letting children leave home, blamed priests for failing to stop them, blamed the children themselves for arrogance in thinking they could succeed where knights and kings had failed. To these writers, the Children's Crusade was no miracle at all, but a cautionary tale about pride disguised as piety. Both views spread together, the tragedy as divine mystery and the tragedy as human folly. Medieval audiences embraced both at once, as they often did. The Middle Ages rarely separated faith from failure, miracle from mistake. A disaster could still be a sign from God, and a doomed march could still carry spiritual meaning. By the 14th century, the story appeared in nearly every major chronicle of medieval Europe. Each retelling shifted the focus slightly. Some placed Stephen at the center, others Nicholas. Others merged the two into a single movement, sweeping across France and Germany like wind across wheat fields. Numbers of participants swelled from thousands to tens of thousands to the entire childhood of Christendom. Time blurred the hard edges of reality until only the legend remained sharp. That legend shaped medieval culture for generations. Painters carved scenes of the Children's Crusade into cathedral walls. Poets compared the lost children to the holy innocence of the Bible, the infants killed by King Herod after Christ's birth. Preachers spoke of them during times of war or famine, reminding listeners of faith betrayed and innocence lost. The story became part of Europe's spiritual vocabulary, invoked whenever Christians pondered the price of zeal and the mystery of suffering. Meanwhile, real history marched on. Later crusades rose and fell. Kingdoms fought, popes quarreled, empires shattered and reformed. Yet the memory of 1212 lingered like a ghost on the edges of these events. Even as Europe changed, the image of children walking toward the sea, faces lifted in faith, refused to vanish. That persistence tells us something about the Middle Ages. Facts alone could not hold the imagination of a world hungry for meaning. People wanted stories that explained sorrow and hope at once. Stories that carried the weight of parables even when history itself offered only confusion. The Children's Crusade gave them such a story. Whether it was told as a miracle, a tragedy, or a warning, it endured because it spoke to something deep within medieval hearts. The longing for innocence in a violent age. The belief that purity might succeed where power had failed. The fear that even the purest hopes could be betrayed. As the centuries passed, that longing and fear would follow the story into new forms, shaping the way later generations remembered 1212, the Children's Crusade would travel from chronicles into art, poetry, drama, and finally into modern history books, carrying with it both the fragments of fact and the weight of legend. Before we follow that journey into the Renaissance and beyond, we must linger a moment on the children themselves, those real young travelers whose lives flicker through the records before disappearing into silence. For whatever else the story became, it began with them, with small feet on long roads, with hunger and hope mingled under the same sun, with faith so fierce it still echoes 800 years later. As centuries passed, the world that had given birth to the Children's Crusade slowly changed. Castles crumbled or turned into noble residences. Cities grew busier, wealthier, more skeptical. The printing press began to replace the monastery. Scribe and explorers crossed oceans the children of 1212 could never have imagined. Yet the story of those children survived these changes. It clung to Europe's memory like ivy on ancient stone, refusing to wither even as the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance. In part, this endurance came from the nature of medieval storytelling itself. Chroniclers rarely wrote with the cold detachment modern historians prize. They wanted readers to feel awe, pity, or moral instruction. So when they copied the tale of the Children's Crusade into new manuscripts, they shaped it to fit the needs of their own time. A scribe in the 14th century might emphasize divine miracles, turning the children into little saints marching under heaven's banner. A scribe in the 15th might focus on betrayal by merchants or kings, turning the tale into a warning about greed and power. Each copy, each retelling, bent the story toward new purposes. As humanism spread through Renaissance Europe, the tale began attracting scholars as well as preachers. Thinkers fascinated by the past collected manuscripts, compared versions, and tried to sort legend from fact. Some concluded the entire crusade was nothing more than myth, a medieval fable woven from scattered accidents. Others insisted it contained a core of truth, though distorted by time and imagination. Debates flared in universities and salons about whether Stephen of Cloyes or Nicholas of Cologne had truly gathered thousands of followers, whether ships had indeed sunk off Sardinia, whether slavers carried children to North Africa. Artists found the story irresistible. Painters filled altarpieces with pale young faces, gazing toward heaven as they marched through rocky landscapes. Poets wrote verses comparing the lost children to lambs wandering without a shepherd. Playwrights dramatized Stephen or Nicholas as tragic prophets betrayed by faithless adults. The tale acquired the melancholy beauty Renaissance audiences loved. Innocence, struggling against a world too cruel to understand it, even as Europe Turned towards science and exploration, the Crusade of 1212 kept its hold on imagination. Travelers crossing the Alps sometimes claimed to see ancient footprints carved into stone where the children had passed. Villagers in France or Germany pointed to ruins they said were once shelters for the marching throngs. These local legends gave the story physical roots in the landscape itself. A church might display a relic said to belong to one of the children. A monastery might keep a manuscript telling how its monks fed the young crusaders on their way south. Fact and folklore intertwined until separating them became almost impossible. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century added another layer. Preachers who opposed Rome sometimes used the Children's Crusade to criticize medieval Catholicism, portraying it as evidence of corruption or superstition. To them, the tragic march showed what happened when the Church misled the innocent with promises of holy victory. Catholic writers replied by praising the children's faith and blaming greedy merchants or secular lords instead. The same story served rival causes, each side shaping it to fit its vision of history. By the 18th century, rationalist thinkers tried to sweep away the legends entirely. Enlightenment historians, armed with skepticism and archives, argued that medieval writers had exaggerated wildly. They saw the Children's Crusade as proof of how ignorance and fanaticism once ruled Europe before reason and science brought light. To them, the story was not about faith or innocence, but about the dangers of superstition leading masses into folly. Yet even as scholars attacked, the tale artists kept it alive. The Romantic movement of the 19th century adored stories of doomed innocence. Poets in Germany and France wrote about the children as symbols of purity crushed by a harsh world. Painters showed long lines of barefoot boys and girls climbing mountains toward a glowing horizon, banners snapping in the wind. Composers wrote music evoking their march, slow and mournful, like prayers drifting over dark seas. During this era, some historians began collecting every scrap of evidence they could find: letters, chronicles, town records, church documents. They compared dates, locations, and numbers, trying to reconstruct what truly happened in 1212. Their work suggested that smaller groups of young people may indeed have set out from France and Germany, perhaps mixing with poor adults, wandering preachers or would-be pilgrims. These movements likely became tangled in memory until later writers imagined a single vast crusade of children. Reality had been messy, scattered, and often pathetic rather than heroic. But legend transformed chaos into a story with beginning, middle, and tragic end. Modern historians continue that work today. Some argue the participants were not mostly children at all, but the rural poor, called puri in Latin, a word meaning both boys and peasants. Others think genuine children did march, inspired by wandering visionaries like Stephen or Nicholas, yet in far smaller numbers than medieval chronicles claimed. Few doubt that hunger, accidents, and perhaps betrayal by merchants brought disaster. But the vast numbers and miraculous elements appear increasingly like later inventions. Still, the legend will not die. Children walking across medieval Europe toward Jerusalem remain an image too haunting to surrender to mere footnotes. It captures something deep in human imagination, the dream of innocence redeeming a corrupt world, the hope that purity and faith might succeed where armies and kings had failed. That dream, even if born from misunderstanding, gave the Children's Crusade its enduring power. In the 20th century, novelists and filmmakers rediscovered the story. Some portrayed the children as heroes of faith, others as victims of fanaticism. others as symbols of youth betrayed by adult ambition. Each retelling reflected its own eras, fears, and ideals. The loss of innocence during world wars, the clash between faith and reason, the longing for meaning in modern times. Yet across all these versions, certain images persist. Children setting out with songs on their lips, the long road through mountains and valleys, the distant sea waiting like fate itself, the storm that ends the dream. These images transcend questions of accuracy. They belong to the realm of myth rather than mere history, carrying emotional truths even when factual ones slip away. And so the children's crusade lives on, both real and unreal, history and legend woven together. To follow its trail is to wander through centuries of faith, sorrow, imagination, and longing. It begins with Stephen or Nicholas in 1212, but stretches through monks' manuscripts, Renaissance paintings, romantic poems, and modern debates. Each generation finds in it whatever lesson or beauty or warning it seeks. Before closing this long journey, we must return once more to the Middle Ages themselves, to the villages and families where it all began, to the parents who watched their children vanish down dusty roads, to the faith that drove them onward, to the silence that followed. For the final part of our story we'll ask, what remains when legend is stripped away and only fragile human lives are left beneath it all? When we look back across 8 centuries, the Children's Crusade seems less like a single event and more like a mosaic of fragments. Some fragments come from chronicles written decades later, others from letters or local records, others from legends whispered in villages or sung by wandering minstrels. Each piece catches a glimmer of something real, yet none gives a full picture. What we can say with some certainty is that, in the summer of 1212, groups of young people and the poor gathered. In parts of France and Germany, stirred by wandering preachers and visions of holy purpose, they believed, or were told, that God had chosen them to recover Jerusalem after so many failed crusades by knights and kings. Perhaps they thought their innocence gave them power armies lacked. Perhaps hunger and poverty drove them to follow any promise of change. They set out to long roads already ancient, through fields and forests, over mountains toward the Mediterranean. Some towns gave them food, others closed their gates in fear or pity. The journey itself was hard. Many would have fallen ill, turned back, or vanished into villages along the way. In France, the figure of Stephen of Cloyes appears, a boy said to have visions of Christ and letters for the king. In Germany, Nicholas of Cologne emerges, leading thousands toward Italy. Whether these leaders truly commanded vast crowds or only inspired smaller bands remains uncertain. Chroniclers loved numbers like 30,000 or 50,000, yet medieval writers often used such figures loosely to mean simply a great many. What seems likely is that by late summer, some of these groups reached the sea. Here the stories darken. Later writers claimed merchants offered ships to carry the children to the Holy Land, but betrayed them into slavery in North Africa. Others wrote of storms sinking the vessels off Sardinia or near the coast of Italy. Modern research suggests some may have boarded ships, others may have dispersed into Italian towns, still others may have tried to reach the Pope seeking blessing or help. The trail fragments until only guesses remain. The parents left behind would have waited for word that rarely came. Some might have heard rumors months or years later about shipwrecks or markets in distant lands. Most probably never learnt the fate of sons or daughters who marched away singing hymns. Their grief left few records, yet echoes faintly through the sorrowful tone of many chronicles. When later generations told the story, they shaped it into a moral drama. To some, it showed divine innocence betrayed by human greed. To others, it warned against fanaticism, leading the simple into ruin. Romantic writers turned it into a symbol of youth and purity lost in a hard world. Historians tried to sift truth from legend, yet found the two fuse together like metal and flame. What endures across all versions is the image of children, walking toward a dream greater than themselves. Whether they numbered hundreds or thousands, whether they sought Jerusalem or simply followed wandering visionaries, whether they ended in shipwreck, slavery, or quiet obscurity, their march captures the imagination because it speaks to universal hopes and fears. We see in them courage and faith, but also vulnerability. We see the power of belief to move even the powerless to attempt impossible things. We see how easily innocence can be misled by promises or visions or the hunger for meaning. The Children's Crusade reminds us that history is not only kings and battles, but ordinary lives swept into currents beyond their control. It shows how memory turns events into stories, how stories gather symbols and morals, until separating fact from myth becomes almost beside the point. Standing at this distance, we cannot give names to most who marched in 1212. We cannot trace their paths through mountain passes or across the sea. Yet we can hear faint echoes in chronicles and legends, in paintings and poems, in the varied persistence of the tale across centuries. Perhaps that persistence itself carries a kind of truth. The children lived once, walked once, hoped once. Their story survived because it touched something enduring in human hearts. The longing for innocence to triumph, the fear of innocence, betrayed the mystery of lives vanishing into silence, leaving only questions behind. And so the Children's Crusade remains one of medieval history's most haunting episodes, balanced between faith and folly, courage and tragedy, reality and myth. It asks us to remember not only what may have happened, but why people kept telling it long after the roads of 1212 grew empty and grass covered the places where small feet once passed on their way to a distant dream. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. This has been the Bedtime Historian, where the past comes alive to guide you into rest. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please like, share, and subscribe for more calming tales of history. Until next time, sleep well and good night.